What are you doing to my daughter?" The voice came like a crack of thunder, slicing through the stillness of the room. Ethan Whitmore stood framed in the doorway of the library, shoulders tense beneath a charcoal grey sweater, rain dripping from his coat onto the polished floor. His eyes, wide and stunned, locked onto the two figures near the fireplace. Grace Monroe didn't flinch. She remained kneeling on the soft rug, her posture calm, one hand resting on the ground, the other still holding the small flashlight that had cast its beam just seconds before. The light was off now, but something irreversible had already happened. Luna sat across from her, 7 years old, dressed in pale grey cotton pajamas, her thin arms wrapped around a frayed teddy bear. Her head was tilted slightly upward, lips parted, her usually unreadable face flickering with something faint but unmistakable. Wonder. Grace waited, heart pounding, not from guilt, but from the weight of what had just passed between them. Luna's voice broke the silence first. "I saw a light. It was quiet, fragile, as though the words weren't just being spoken, but discovered." Ethan's feet moved on. Their own, "What did you just say?" Luna didn't turn toward him. Her chin remained lifted, her gaze still angled toward the space where the flashlight beam had once hovered. She blinked once. Slowly, "I saw a light," she whispered again. Ethan stared at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time. He dropped to a crouch, forgetting the wet trail behind him, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Luna, can you see something?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled into the bear's ear. Then she tilted her face just slightly toward him, not fully, not confidently, but enough. "It was warm," she murmured, "like the sun." Grace rose to her feet slowly, tucking the flashlight back into her apron. "I didn't mean to startle her. I was testing something." Ethan stood too, his expression sharp with confusion. "Testing what?" "I think she saw the beam," Grace said. "Not fully, maybe not clearly, but she reacted. Twice." "That's impossible," Ethan said. "She's blind." Grace finished for him, but gently. "Yes, that's what you've believed. But something happened just now, and I think we need to pay attention." Ethan looked away, jaw tightening, breath unsteady. "You don't understand. I've spent 7 years with specialists. I've watched her sit in silence, stare through rooms, never speak. Nothing has ever changed." "Until now," Grace said softly. He hesitated. She's probably repeating a word she heard, some old memory. "Then why now?" Grace pressed. "Why today?" She didn't need to say it. They both knew the answer, because something had shifted, because Grace had seen the girl turn her head toward a glint of light, because, for the first time, Luna had spoken on her own, and not just spoken, but connected. Ethan ran a hand down his face, suddenly exhausted. "I'm calling Marla. She'll bring the drops." Grace's voice sharpened. "Please don't." "Not yet." He looked up, surprised by her tone. "Why not?" Grace hesitated, choosing her next words with care. "I don't think the drops are helping." His expression darkened. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not blaming anyone," she said quickly, "but I've watched every morning she gets those eye drops. No one questions what's in them. No one asks why." Ethan crossed the room in 2 long strides, anger rising. "Those drops were prescribed by a specialist. They're supposed to reduce ocular discomfort, sensitivity, and maybe they are," Grace said, holding her ground. "But what if they're also muting something, blocking something she's only now starting to access?" "You've been here 8 weeks," he said sharply. And now you're an expert. No, she replied. But I know what I saw. Luna stirred beside them. Both adults turned to her. She had shifted, ever so slightly, closer to the patch of carpet where the flashlight had glowed. Her fingers brushed the edge of the rug, as if trying to recapture the sensation. I saw it, she said again, barely louder than a breath. Then she looked at Grace. Her gaze, soft, uncertain, landed just shy of her shoulder. But it landed. Grace stepped forward. Just give it one day. No drops, no interference. If nothing happens, I'll never speak of this again. Ethan didn't respond right away. His hand hovered near the phone in his pocket. But his eyes were on his daughter, who now, inexplicably, was facing the light spilling in from the hallway. She was tracking it, however faintly, with her head. I've been protecting her, he said finally, voice low. For 7 years, I've done everything I was told. Everything I could afford, and none of it has ever worked. Maybe it wasn't about doing more, Grace said. Maybe it was about waiting long enough for her to show us how. Ethan looked down at Luna again. The little girl stood slowly, gripping the teddy bear like an anchor. Her face turned, deliberately this time, toward the glow beyond the room. She took one step, small, cautious, but real. Then she stopped, turned back, and whispered, I saw a light. Grace's breath caught. Ethan, for the first time in years, allowed something to flicker behind his guarded eyes. Belief. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because in that moment, Luna had spoken for all of them. Ethan didn't respond right away. His eyes lingered on the child, and the miracle then flicked back to the woman standing there with a flashlight still warm in her pocket. For the first time, he didn't see a housekeeper. He saw something else. Grace looked away, unsure if she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Luna had spoken. Luna had reached, and suddenly it all came back the morning after. Luna spoke. The house felt different, not louder, not warmer, just aware, as if the walls themselves had overheard those 3 fragile words and were waiting for someone to believe them. Grace Monroe moved quietly through the kitchen, hands steady but mind racing. She filled the kettle, watching the water catch faint streaks of morning light. She didn't need caffeine, hadn't since the hospital. What she needed was clarity. Because what had happened last night wasn't a dream. Luna had spoken, and, not in confusion or mimicry, she had described something. I saw a light. Grace's heart stirred again at the memory. It had been so soft, so sudden, yet undeniable. And the way Luna had touched her apron, the smallest gesture, but deliberate like. A thread tying her to something she couldn't name. Still want tea? Lorraine's voice broke through the haze. The older woman was already setting out 2 mismatched mugs. Her usual scowl softened at the edges. Grace nodded. Double quotes, thanks, she said, accepting the warm cup without looking up. You didn't sleep, Lorraine added, more observation than question. No, Grace admitted, but not for the usual reasons. Lorraine didn't pry. She rarely did. But as she handed Grace the creamer, their eyes met for a moment too long. She said something, didn't she? Lorraine whispered, her fingers tightening around the handle of the teapot. Grace blinked. You heard walls here. They carry sound like bones, carry memory. Lorraine's mouth pressed into a line. Don't say anything to Dennis. He'll report it up the chain before Luna finishes the next word. Grace nodded silently, the warning sitting heavy in her chest. She understood now this wasn't just a family. It was a system, a machine. and even the tiniest change in Luna could disrupt its rhythm. She excused herself and stepped out into the hallway. The polished floors gleamed, too pristine to feel lived in, but she was beginning to see past that to the wear beneath the polish. The doorframe where Luna's fingers always touched, the uneven spot in the carpet where Ethan had paced one night too long, the scuff on the baseboard near the nursery, signs of grief, Grace thought, signs of life trying to resume and failing. She passed the sitting room where Luna had first spoken and paused at the threshold. The sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting a dappled reflection across the floor, like broken glass. And in the center, the flashlight still lay where she had dropped it. Grace picked it up gently, cradling it like something sacred. She made her way upstairs, past the linen closet and toward Luna's room. The door, as always, was slightly ajar. Grace didn't knock, just waited, listening. Inside, Luna sat on her window bench, teddy bear in her lap, head turned slightly toward the lake. Her lips weren't moving, no hum today, just stillness. Grace stepped inside. "I brought you something," she said softly, crouching to place a small object on the floor, a sensory cube she'd found in the storage room. One side lit up when tapped. Another played a soft chime. Luna didn't move. Grace didn't press. She simply sat down beside the bookshelf, pulled out her notebook, and began writing. Entry 17. She's quiet again, but not gone. There's a difference between stillness and silence, and I think she's starting to understand that. The day passed slowly. Grace washed linens, sorted kitchen shelves, and repaired a torn cushion in the librarial, the while replaying that moment again and again. By evening, Ethan had not spoken to her. She found him standing at the edge of the lawn just before sunset, near the path that led down to the lake. His posture was stiff, hands buried in his coat pockets, jaw tight. Grace didn't speak. She approached quietly, stopping a few feet away. "She used to walk down here," Ethan said without turning, "with her mother, every Sunday, even after. Even when Luna got sick, they still came." Grace followed his gaze to the shoreline. The lake was still, silver light bleeding into it from the horizon. A small bench sat beneath the weathered pine, half swallowed by moss. She liked the fog, he said it made the world quieter, more manageable. "And now?" Grace asked gently. Ethan finally looked at her. "Now, it just feels like something unfinished." The wind stirred, lifting strands of Grace's hair. She waited. "I read the notes," he said. "From your journal. Lorraine gave them to me." Grace tensed. "I didn't mean for anyone to. I'm glad she did." His voice cracked slightly. "Because I'd forgotten how to hope." That admission startled her. "I don't know if it was the flashlight, or your presence, or something inside Luna finally breaking through," he added, "but it doesn't matter. What matters is that it happened." Grace nodded, blinking against the wind. "And if it happens again?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then said, "Then we keep going." A pause. "I've asked Marla not to give the drops tomorrow," he said. "Just one day, we'll see." Grace's breath caught. "Thank you," he nodded once, then added, "You were right. This house. It hasn't breathed in years." And without another word, he turned and walked back up the hill, his silhouette dissolving into the last of the fading light. Grace remained at the lakeside until the sky turned navy. The surface of the water barely moved, but in its reflection, the windows of the Whitmore estate flickered on, one by one, She looked up at them, eyes resting on the second floor where Luna's room was. She's not broken, Grace thought. She's waiting to be found. She wrapped her coat tighter and started up the path, not knowing what the next day would bring, only that something had begun. And sometimes beginnings speak louder than miracles. Grace stood at the edge of the lake long after Ethan had gone. The last traces of dusk shimmered on the water, and the house behind her blinked to life, one warm window at a time. But it wasn't the lights in the house that stayed with her, it was what flickered behind Luna's eyes, that shimmer, that shift, that possibility. She saw something. Grace felt it in her bones. And so, the next morning, as the mist clung low over the lawn and the house stirred awake in quiet rhythm, Grace climbed the stairs with a question pulsing behind her. Ribs, what happens if I try again? She didn't know what she'd find in that room, but she knew exactly where to look. The first time Grace saw it, she thought it was a trick of the light. It was early morning. The house hadn't fully woken yet. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a silver sky, and fog crept along the ground like a memory trying to return. Grace was dusting the reading nook near the window in Luna's room. Luna, as always, sat silently. By the glass, legs folded beneath her, teddy bear tucked under one arm. Grace's phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A message from the pharmacy. She glanced at the screen, and in doing so, the flashlight feature flicked on by accident. A sharp beam of white light danced across the floor, then across Luna's face. In that split second, Grace saw it. A blink, not slow or sleepy, not random, a clear, quick response. She froze, her breath caught as if the world had paused. Luna's expression didn't change. Her body remained still, but her eyelids, they had moved. They had reacted. Grace slowly tilted. The phone again, another beam, another flicker, then nothing. She clicked the phone off, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't say a word, but her mind had already leaped miles ahead. Could it be real? Could she see something? Anything. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She sat at the small desk in her room, notebook open, candle flickering beside her, and wrote one sentence again and again. She blinked at the light. Then, underneath it, that wasn't an accident. Over the next few days, Grace began testing again, but slowly, gently. Never enough to frighten Luna, never enough to draw suspicion. She walked with a little more weight in her step when entering the room, then with none at all. She opened the curtains wider one day, then narrower the next. She passed by silently, then with a soft sound. Each time, she observed. Each time, Luna gave something away. A head tilt, a flicker of lashes, a subtle tightening of her grip on. The bare Grace didn't say anything to the staff. Not to Dennis, not even to Lorraine, who had started warming up to her over early morning coffees. And certainly not to Ethan, who had grown accustomed to hearing no news about his daughter. Because what Grace had wasn't news. Not yet, it was hope. And hope, she had learned, was something you handled carefully like wet paint or a newborn soul. You didn't rush it. You waited for it to show you what it wanted to become. One afternoon, while folding linens outside the girls' room, Grace heard something. A hum. It was quiet, fragile, but unmistakable. Not a tune, not a melody, more like a murmur, as if Luna was whispering to something only she could hear. Grace stepped closer to the open door. Luna was seated on the floor, not by the window this time, but beside the bookshelf. Her fingers traced the spine of a book she couldn't read. Her lips moved softly. Grace sat down just outside the room, out of sight, and listened. "Light," Luna whispered. "Light, Mummy." Grace's eyes stung. The words weren't clear, but they weren't random either. They came with emotion, as if the girl was trying to reach through the fog inside her to remember something. Or someone. Later that night, Grace stood by the nursery door. The room had never changed. The soft mobile above the crib, the pastel curtains, the rocking chair in the corner. It had been frozen since the accident that took Luna's mother. Frozen in the exact moment Ethan's world had stopped spinning. Grace whispered into the stillness. No one told her how to move forward. They just taught her how to sit still. The next day, she tried something else. She found an old sensory toy in the storage room, a cube with buttons and textures. But one side had a light-up panel that blinked when tapped. She placed it on the rug in Luna's room, just far enough. A way to be neutral, not intrusive. She tapped it once. The lights blinked red and green dot. Nothing. She tapped again. Then waited. Luna didn't turn her head, but her foot moved. Not much, just a twitch toward the sound, but Grace caught it. So she tried again the next day with a different object. A flashlight this time, but not aimed at Luna, just turned on near a wall, casting a slow-moving shadow across the floor. Luna's eyes followed it. Grace stood still for nearly a full minute, breath held tight in her chest. Then Luna whispered, barely audible, "It's dancing." Grace stepped back, almost dizzy. That night, she didn't write in her notebook. She simply sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window, and whispered to the stars, "You're still in there, aren't you?" By the end of the week, she'd noticed something else. The staff gave Luna a set of drops each morning, clear, odorless, delivered by the nurse with automatic precision. Grace asked about them casually one day, routine. Dennis said, without looking up, "Prescribed years ago, some optic nerve pressure management thing." "But if she's blind?" Grace asked, trailing off. Dennis shrugged. "Doesn't hurt to try, I suppose. Mr. Whitmore insists on continuity." Grace nodded, but her gut twisted. That night, when no one was looking, she checked the cabinet where the medicine was stored. No prescription label, just a glass bottle. Handwritten initials, a date long expired. She photographed it discreetly, heart racing. This wasn't routine, this was ritual. The next morning, Grace didn't give the drops just for one day. Instead, she sat by the window as Luna played with her. "Bear, do you like the light in here?" she asked softly. Luna turned her head toward the sun and smiled. It was brief, a blink of joy. But it was real, and Grace knew. The world had told this child who she was. Now it was time to ask who she could be. "What did you just say?" Ethan's voice sliced through the quiet like glass shattering on marble. He had dropped his phone, forgotten entirely that he was still wearing his wristwatch from the boardroom. Luna stood frozen by the window, her small fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. Her lips trembled slightly, eyes distant, but not empty. Grace was beside her, calm but firm, the flashlight still warm in her hand. "I said." Grace repeated gently, "I don't think she's blind. Not completely." Ethan stared at his daughter, trying to believe the words. But it was her voice. That echoed louder in his mind. "I saw a light." It hadn't been a fluke. It wasn't a murmur or a mimic. It was clear. It was hers. Luna hadn't spoken like that in years. 7 years, to be exact. 7 silent birthdays. 7 autumns where leaves fell and she never described their color. 7 Christmases where the tree sparkled, but not in her eyes. And now, this stranger, this housemaid, barely 2 months into the job, stood there telling him something so outrageous, so impossible. "Leave us," Ethan snapped at Grace, his voice cracking under the weight of panic and fury. "Right now," Grace looked at Luna, then back at him. "I think you're afraid." "Afraid," he repeated, stunned. "Because if I'm right," she said softly, "then everything you believed was wrong." There was a silence so sharp, it felt like the room inhaled. Ethan turned away, out. "Please." Grace hesitated. Luna reached for her. "Please," Ethan repeated, softer this time. "I need a moment." That night, Ethan sat alone in his study, lights dim, Luna's childhood, photo in hand. In the image, she was 3B for the accident, before the doctors, before the diagnosis. She wore a daisy-patterned dress, and her eyes were wide open. Bright as summer, he whispered into the stillness. What if she was never blind? The thought coiled in his chest like smoke. He'd trusted them, the specialists, the prescriptions, the routines. He'd done everything he was told. Because what else do you do when your world collapses and someone hands you a manual on how to keep breathing? He opened the drawer, took out the small glass bottle delivered to the house weekly, unlabeled. No pharmacy seal, no instructions, just a faint chemical smell and a memory of routine. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Grace," he said when she answered, "I want you to take the drops to someone you trust. Quietly, tell me what's really in them." The next morning, Grace boarded a train to Seattle, the bottle wrapped in linen, tucked into her coat. She didn't sleep during the ride. She couldn't. Not after Luna had said her name so clearly. Not after she'd seen her smile at sunlight. She met Dr. Sophia Reyes in a modest lab just off campus. Sophia had been a friend from nursing school, a woman of sharp eyes and a sharper sense of right and wrong. They hadn't spoken in years, but the moment Grace explained what she'd seen, Sophia leaned in without hesitation. "I'll run a full analysis," she said, turning the vial in her hand. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at a deliberate suppression of neural function." Grace swallowed hard, like blocking light reflex. "Worse," Sophia said. "If the optic nerve isn't damaged and she's responding, now something's been masking the input. That would take serious compounds and time. Time like 7 years." Sophia's jaw clenched. It's possible if someone wanted to make her appear unresponsive, unrecoverable. Grace stared at her. But why would anyone want that? Sophia didn't answer. She just set the vial down with surgical care. "Come back tomorrow." The results were worse than expected. Cyclopentalot, atropine, in concentrations higher than approved for pediatric use. Sophia looked furious. This would paralyze the pupil. Repeated use in a developing brain could mute visual processing for years. It wouldn't damage the eye. It would mask its function. Grace felt cold. So, she wasn't treated. She was silenced. Sophia nodded grimly. "This isn't medicine. This is misdirection." Grace's voice shook, and whoever ordered it had to know exactly what they were doing. Sophia placed a hand on hers. "Who's her doctor?" "I only know the name on her earliest files," Grace said. "Elias Thorne." Sophia's eyes widened. "That Elias Thorne, you know him." Everyone in pediatric neurology knew him a decade ago. Brilliant, unorthodox. Then 3 cases vanished under peer review, and he dropped out of public records. There were whispers. Clinical trials gone too far. Children used as baseline studies. Grace felt nausea rise, and now he's disappeared. Sophia's gaze turned hard. You're not dealing with a mistake, Grace. You're dealing with a cover-up. Back at the estate, Grace found Ethan standing in the hallway, looking out the window at the lake. He didn't turn as she approached. Well, he asked. She wasn't blind, Grace said simply. They made her look blind. Ethan exhaled sharply. How do you live with something like that? Grace didn't answer right away. Then, softly, the same way you live with grief, one unbearable day at a time. Until one day, it isn't unbearable anymore. He finally looked at her. I didn't protect her. No, Grace said, gently but firmly. But you can now. She placed a small file on the windowsill lab. Results, notes, names. She still has time, she whispered. Her brain can learn to process light again. But we need to stop whatever's still holding her back. Ethan stared at the paper, then back out the window. Outside, Luna was sitting on the porch steps, her sketch pad in her lap. She was drawing. The sun played on her cheeks. Her eyes moved toward the light, and for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore allowed himself to hope. The first sign was subtle, almost too small to notice. Luna reached toward the window when the light shifted through the stained glass panel near the stairwell. Her fingers paused mid-air, and she smiled slowly, softly, like something within her was remembering how to wake up. She saw it. Grace whispered. Ethan, standing behind her, didn't speak. He just watched his daughter, silent, blinking. Beautiful trace color on her palm, like it was music. It had been 3 weeks since they stopped the eye drops. 3 weeks of watching, waiting, praying that the science would hold, that their hope hadn't been naive. 3 weeks of carefully, gently reintroducing Luna to the world. She turned her head again. Grace noted in her journal. Second reflex today. No blinking, but consistent response to movement and shifting brightness. Each page was filled with scribbled records, sketches of angles, light positioning, Luna's posture, timestamps. It looked like research, but to Grace, it was reverence. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his voice quiet. Why do you write everything down? Grace closed the notebook. Because I want her to read it one day, to know what she survived, and who she became. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. Do you think she'll remember? Grace didn't hesitate. I think her heart already does. That night, after Luna fell asleep, humming to herself a sound Ethan hadn't heard since she was 3, Grace sat in the library, laptop open, searching everything she could find on Dr. Elias Thorne. There wasn't much. No active license. No teaching posts. A few ghost references in outdated neurology forums. A closed malpractice inquiry from 6 years ago, marked inconclusive. The trail went cold in 2018 until she found an archived article buried in an old academic journal. Suppression in Pediatric Neurology, Unregulated Frontiers. The author, Dr. Elias Thorne, published just months before he vanished. In it, he proposed controversial methods, temporary sensory shutdown to reroute developmental trauma, experimental, unapproved, ethically unstable, and one-line chilled. To render what the brain perceives null is to offer it a blank slate for engineered cognition. Engineered, not healed. She printed the article and brought it to Ethan. He read in silence, lips tightening with every paragraph. When he finished, he set the paper down with slow precision. I followed the wrong man, he said. You followed your grief, Grace replied. And grief is a terrible guide. It only sees fog and calls it direction. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, I want to find him. Together, they pulled up Luna's earliest files. One page caught Grace's eye, hidden beneath insurance forms, single signature. E. Thorne, M.D., Redwood Pediatric Research Institute, Confidential Patient Program, Phase 2. What's that? Ethan asked. Phase 2 means there was a Phase 1, Grace murmured. The address listed was in San Diego. The institute had since been dissolved. But Grace traced the trail forward, call by call, email by email, until she found something unexpected, a payment record from the institute, made to a private consultancy now registered under a different name, and that consultancy had recently hired one Dr. Elias Thorne under an alias. Found him, Grace said, heart pounding. He was working at a remote rehabilitation facility in Montana, under the name Elliot Graves. Ethan made the call personally. This is Ethan Whitmore, he said, calm but cold. I know who you are, and I want answers. The line was silent. Then a familiar, careful voice replied, Mr. Whitmore, I'm surprised to hear from you after so long. You shouldn't be, Ethan said. You're the one who told me my daughter would never see the world. And has she? Thorne asked, with clinical detachment. Ethan's jaw clenched. She's starting to. After 7 years of sedation disguised as treatment. Thorne didn't deny it. You were desperate. You wanted silence. I gave you a version of it. Grace, listening beside Ethan, stiffened. You didn't treat her, Ethan said. You silenced her. I redirected a child who couldn't handle trauma, Thorne replied. Your wife died in a crash, Mr. Whitmore. You were spiraling. That child was inconsolable. You asked for a solution. I asked for help, Ethan said, his voice cracking. You gave me control. Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, some wounds don't heal with light. They need darkness. Grace stepped forward, taking the phone. But she was never broken. You just couldn't stand her brightness. The line clicked. Disconnected. Later that night, Ethan stood by Luna's bedside. She was asleep, her sketchpad clutched to her chest, the corner of a drawing poking out a golden beam crossing a field of grey. She sees it, he whispered. Grace stood beside him. She chooses to see it. He looked at her. What happens next? Grace answered without hesitation. We report it. We document everything. We talk to the right people. I know someone who can help Dr. Reyes. She'll know what to do. And if we fail, Ethan asked. We won't, Grace said. Because this time we're not hiding. He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. I've built companies, broken records, made billions. But I've never felt smaller than standing in front of my daughter, realizing I never really saw her. Grace touched his shoulder. Then let's start seeing everything. No more silence. Outside the window, morning broke, and for the first time in years, the Whitmore house welcomed the light. It began with a headline: Billionaire father refused treatment that could have saved his daughter's sight, sources say. Ethan stood, frozen in the kitchen, phone in one hand, coffee untouched in the other. The morning light spilled across the marble countertops, but he didn't feel the warmth. The article was spreading fast. Photos from years ago, ones he never approved, were now on news feeds and gossip blogs. Luna's face, pixelated, His past mistakes, unfiltered. Grace appeared in the doorway, holding Luna's breakfast tray. She paused when she saw his expression. They went public, Ethan said. Horsely. Grace set the tray down. How someone leaked it. The article twists everything. Says I withheld care, ignored medical advice, that I wanted her to stay blind. Grace moved closer. That's not the truth, and anyone who knows you, who knows her, will feel it. He gave a bitter laugh. Truth doesn't sell. Scandal does. Then his phone chimed again. Another notification. Another article, and then another. Grace's phone buzzed too. She picked it up and froze. What is it? Ethan asked. Her voice was flat. A text. No number. Just ... You should have stayed quiet. Even angels can fall. He reached for the phone. It was a screenshot of her son's birth certificate. For a second, Grace didn't breathe. They know about my baby, she whispered. Grace, she backed away, her hand trembling. How would they have that? That hospital shut down 6 years ago. His file isn't even digital. Ethan took her shoulders gently. Hey, look at me. They're trying to scare you. That means we're close to something real. But that child, her voice cracked. He only lived for 12 hours. And now they're using him to threaten me. You're not alone in this, Ethan said firmly. Not anymore. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside the Whitmore estate had changed. Not with shouting or alarms, but with silence. The kind that echoes before something breaks. The house staff started disappearing. The groundskeeper called in sick and never returned. The housekeeper, who had folded Luna's clothes for 4 years, suddenly handed in her notice. No explanation. And one morning, Grace came down to the kitchen and found her favorite mug shattered on the floor. No note. No one admitted it. They're isolating us, she told Ethan, one by one. We tightened the circle, he replied. Only people we trust, and we keep moving forward. Despite the fear, progress unfolded like petals in spring. Luna was changing. Rapidly, she traced her fingers along shadow lines, giggled when sunlight danced on the wall, and even reached out to catch a feather drifting past the porch. One afternoon, Grace set a blank piece of paper in front of her, along with crayons. Draw what you feel, she said. Luna frowned. Feel. Grace smiled. Yes, you don't have to see to feel something beautiful. But Luna picked up the yellow crayon, then blue, then red, and she drew ... light. Rays beaming from a corner. Off the page, falling on a small figure holding another's hand. Ethan walked in just as she finished. He stopped, watching her from the doorway. What's that, sweetheart? Luna looked up at him, her eyes bright. It's the light she gave me. Ethan swallowed hard. He asked gently. Luna nodded. Grace. His voice faltered. You see her? Luna tilted her head. I always did, but now I see with her. That night, after Luna had gone to bed, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch. She said she sees with you, Ethan murmured. Not just you, but with you, as if ... you're part of her vision. Grace looked out at the lake. Children don't. Separate light from love, not like we do. He nodded slowly. I spent years thinking I was protecting her. Turns out I was hiding from her. Grace glanced over. You weren't hiding. You were grieving in the only way you knew how. He looked at her then, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. Do you ever stop grieving? No, she said softly. But you learn to carry it with both hands, so it doesn't spill all over the people you love. The next morning, Grace received a phone call. The woman's voice was shaky, but determined. "My name is Diane. I read the article. About Luna. I think the same doctor treated my son. He was only 5. Grace sat up straight. "Dr. Thorne. I didn't know his real name until now. He used an alias with USCs, said he specialized in sensory therapy. He gave my son drops, told me not to ask questions. 2 years later, my boy stopped responding to sound, to touch. He's in assisted care now." Grace's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry." "I kept quiet out of shame," the woman said. "But after what I read about your girl, I think I need to speak up. You're not the only ones." Grace's voice was steady. "Then maybe it's time we speak together." That night, Ethan placed a fresh journal on Grace's bedside table. "What's this?" she asked. "Something to write the future in," he said. "We've documented the darkness long enough. Maybe now we start recording the light." Grace opened the cover. Inside, he'd written one line. "This is the story of how a little girl taught us to see." She looked up at him. "You really believe we'll win?" He nodded. "Not because we're strong, but because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It has a habit of rising just like the sun." And outside their window, for the first time in days, the sky was clear. The stars blinked like promises, and in the quiet of the night, the world felt just a little more awake. The courtroom was warmer than Grace expected, not just in temperature, but in presence. There was no thunderous gavel, no echoing silence from high ceilings, just rows of ordinary people, some holding hands, others clutching tissues, all waiting for justice to catch. Up with time, Grace sat in the front row, her palms damp, heart thudding like a slow drum beat. Beside her, Ethan adjusted his tie with trembling fingers. It wasn't the expensive courtroom suit that made him look different. Today it was the way he held himself, stripped of power, but full of purpose. "They'll ask why we waited," he murmured. Grace met his eyes. "You didn't wait, you woke up. That takes more courage than most." The bailiff called the session to order. "Case number 4219B, State of Oregon versus Elias Thorne." The courtroom doors opened. Dr. Thorne walked in, flanked by marshals. He looked smaller than Grace remembered from the article's odor, paler, as if the years had eaten away at him from the inside out. But his eyes, sharp and cold, scanned the room like a man still certain he'd walk free. When he spotted Grace, he paused for a breath, then looked away. Ethan leaned in. "He remembers you. Good," she said, voice steady. "So will the world." The prosecutor's opening argument was methodical, precise. A trail of paper, prescriptions, and power. They laid it out plainly. Thorne had manipulated consent. Forms, disguised experimental trials as legitimate treatments, and targeted children with rare conditions under the pretense of offering hope. Then came the families. One by one, they took the stand. A mother who'd buried 2 sons. A father who admitted he hadn't spoken to his daughter in 6 years because she no longer knew my voice. A young man who had lost the ability to read light altogether. Their stories weren't performances. They were wounds. And when Grace was called, the room fell into a silence so complete. It was as though the very air held its breath. She stepped to the stand, gave her name, and then they asked her to tell her story. But instead of reading from the notes she had carefully prepared, Grace looked toward the jury and spoke from the heart. "I was hired to clean, to cook, to fold sheets and do laundry. No one expected me to see what others had missed. But you don't need a medical degree to know when a child's being silenced. You just have to care enough to listen. She paused, eyes glistening. Luna Whitmore was supposed to be blind. That's what they told her father. What they told every nurse, every therapist, every teacher. But when I held a flashlight to her face, she flinched. And for the first time in 7 years, she said, "I saw a light." The jury shifted. I started watching. I stopped assuming. And what I found was this. Luna hadn't just lost her sight. She'd been kept from it, intentionally, daily, with drops that had no business being used on a child without explanation. She looked toward Thorne. I don't know what drove this man to do what he did, but I know the difference between blindness and being blinded. A gasp rippled in the gallery. Ethan closed his eyes. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. No further questions. But then came the defense, cold, precise, dismissive. You were a housemaid. What made you believe you had the authority to question a medical diagnosis? Grace didn't flinch, because I was the only one who looked her in the eye. The lawyer frowned. So, your entire argument rests on your feeling that something was wrong. Grace took a breath. No, it rests on the fact that Luna now sees color, that she can recognize faces, that she laughs in sunlight and paints with her eyes open. And none of that happened until we stopped giving her the drugs your client prescribed. Murmurs stirred again. The judge tapped the gavel lightly. Order. The defense attorney leaned forward. You lost a child, didn't you? Gasps. Ethan's face hardened. Grace froze. Objection, the prosecutor snapped. Irrelevant and inappropriate. Sustained, the judge said sternly. But Grace, though rattled, held her ground. Yes, she said, voice breaking but clear. I lost my son. He never got to open his eyes. That's why I fight so hard for the ones who still can. Silence. Grace's gaze swept the jury. I may not be a doctor, but I am a mother. And mothers know when something is being taken from a child. When she stepped down, the courtroom didn't applaud, but they didn't have to. The weight of her words stayed in the air, like the last note of a hymn. Outside, reporters lined the sidewalk. Ethan shielded Grace as they moved past the cameras. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. She looked up at him. No. Do you? He shook his head. It took losing everything to see what truly mattered. Just then, his phone buzzed. A message from Diantha, mother who had called Grace weeks earlier. I'm here watching from the back. Thank you. Grace smiled softly. We're not alone in this anymore. No, Ethan said. And neither is Luna. That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Luna sat at the table. Scribbling with her crayons, she held up a new drawing to Grace and Ethan. A bright yellow sun, a girl in a dress, and 2 tall figures standing behind her, one holding a flashlight, the other a heart. What's this one called? Grace asked gently. Luna beamed. Courtroom of Light. Ethan blinked. Why that title? Luna shrugged. Because that's where the dark started to go away. Grace looked at Ethan, and in that moment between shadows and sunrise, they both knew. The hardest part wasn't over, but the light had found a way in, and it was spreading. The rain had stopped, for the first time in months. The lake behind the Whitmore estate shimmered under an open sky, its surface like glass touched by sunrise. The house, once a silent monument to grief, now pulsed with the quiet rhythm of healing footsteps, humming and the faint sound of laughter, Luna was sitting by the large bay window, crisscross applesauce on a woven rug, tracing colored pencils across a sketchpad. The sunlight spilled over her shoulder, dancing on the page like a living thing. Grace sat nearby, folding laundry on the couch, but mostly watching her. "Green," Luna said, holding up a crayon, "like the grass when it rains." Grace smiled. "That's right. And this," Luna added, lifting a yellow one, "is like your voice when you laugh." Grace's hands froze mid-fold. "What do you mean?" "It's warm," Luna said simply, tapping the crayon to her chest. "It tickles here." There it was, again, the way Luna felt the world, not just through sight, but through emotion, through trust, through presence. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat and smiled. "You make the room brighter when you talk like that," she whispered. Luna grinned. "Then I want to talk every day." Downstairs, Ethan sat at the long kitchen table, thumbing through legal letters and follow-up reports from the district attorney's office. The conviction had gone through. Dr. Elias Thorne would not see the outside world again, not without iron bars between him and the sky. But even with the justice secured, there were wounds that didn't heal with verdicts. "You haven't touched your coffee," Grace said, walking in. Ethan looked up, "Didn't realize I poured one." She sat down beside him. "You've barely slept." He exhaled. "I keep thinking about all the things I didn't do. For years, I thought I was protecting her by following the experts. But now I wonder, was I protecting her, or just protecting myself from guilt?" Grace reached for his hand. "Ethan," she said softly, "there's a difference between being blind and refusing to see. You did what you thought was best, and when the truth came, you chose it. That's what matters." He looked at her, eyes tired but alive. "I used to measure success by markets and patents," he murmured. "Now I watch my daughter trace sunlight on the Florand that feels like the biggest miracle I've ever known. You're not alone in that." Their hands stayed entwined. Later that afternoon, a moving crew arrived, not to pack up, but to transform. One of the long-unused guest rooms upstairs was being emptied. Boxes of paints, easels, drawing paper, and light tables began to fill the space. Ethan stood at the doorway, watching. "This room used to be for storage," he said. "Not anymore," Grace replied. "It's hers now." Luna came running down the hallway, nearly tripping in her socks. "Did the paints come?" "They did," Grace said. "And the light board, come see." Luna burst into the room, spinning once in delight. The large windows bathed the walls in gold, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a place where echoes lived. It felt like breath. Ethan watched as Luna knelt by a fresh canvas and began painting without hesitation, bold strokes of red, orange, and cobalt. Grace handed her a cup of water and a brush. "What's this one called?" Ethan asked. Luna looked up and grinned. "It's called Alive." He blinked. "Why?" "Because the colors don't hide anymore," she said. "They show up, like me." Ethan stepped back, as if the words had struck something sacred. Grace saw his chest rise with the weight of a realization. "You know," he said slowly, "we've been calling this place Whitmore House for years. Maybe it's time we stop calling it a house." "What then?" Grace asked. He turned to Luna. "Maybe it's finally a home." That evening, as twilight folded over the estate, Grace stepped outside onto the porch. The sky was brushed with lavender and the lake mirrored the last light of day. Ethan joined her, holding 2 mugs of tea. "She told me she remembered the smell of her mother's sweater," he said quietly. She didn't say it in a sentence, just, "I remember soft wool and flowers." Grace closed her eyes. It's all coming back to her. He nodded, and I think it's coming back to me too. They stood in silence for a while. Then Ethan asked, "Do you ever think you were meant to be here?" Grace laughed softly. "Every day, even on the hard ones. Especially on the hard ones." "I'm sorry you lost your son," he said. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Me too, but I think he led me here." Ethan turned to face her fully. "You've given Luna what no one else could, what I didn't know how to give." Grace placed her hand on his chest. "You gave her life." I just reminded her it was worth living. A breeze rolled in, gentle and cool. Somewhere inside, Luna's laughter echoed down the hall like music. Ethan smiled. "Do you hear that?" "I do," Grace whispered. "That's what a room sounds like when it learns to laugh." That night, Luna hung her newest painting above her bed. It was a swirl of soft golds and pale blues, with a figure standing in the center, arms outstretched toward a sun just beginning to rise. Grace tucked her in. "Can I tell you something?" Luna asked. "Of course. I used to think the world was asleep, like a big dream I couldn't touch. And now," Luna rolled onto her side, "now I think it was just waiting for me to wake up." Grace kissed her forehead. "And we're so glad you did." As the light dimmed and the stars emerged one by one above the Oregon trees, a gentle peace settled over the home. It was no longer a place of secrets, no longer a house of silence. It was a room that had learned to laugh, and in that laughter lived something stronger than sight. It was love, and love, at last, was being seen. The gallery smelled faintly of varnished wood and fresh paint. It was a converted church-arched ceilings, tall windows, and soft afternoon light filtering through panes of stained glass. Rows of chairs filled the open space, some occupied by strangers, others by friends who had witnessed the journey. But front and center sat two familiar faces, Ethan Hale and Grace Monroe, holding hands in quiet awe. On the far wall hung 32 paintings. Every canvas told a story, not with words, but with light. Luna stood to the side of the podium, her hair pulled back simply, wearing a pale blue dress that caught the light like silk on water. She was 14 now, tall and slender, her once hesitant presence replaced with quiet, luminous confidence. She stepped up to the microphone, cleared her throat, and waited. The room stilled. "When I was a little girl," Luna began, her voice steady but soft, "I was told I couldn't see. People whispered it around me, talked about me like I was glass, fragile, untouchable." A murmur of breath moved through the audience. "But I did see," she continued, "just not the way they thought. I saw warmth. I saw silence. I saw the shape of pain in people's voices." She looked down for a moment, then up again, this time toward Grace. "I saw the first light, not with my eyes," Luna said, her voice trembling slightly, "but with her heart." The room went quiet again, heavier now. I don't remember the first time she spoke to me, but I remember how it felt like someone opened a window in a room I didn't know I was trapped. Inside, a tear slipped down Ethan's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Luna smiled. "This collection is called First Light. It's not just about sight. It's about truth. It's about love. And it's about how healing doesn't always look like a miracle. Sometimes looks like a person staying." She stepped away from the podium. The audience rose in applause, but not the loud kind. It was soft, prolonged, deeply reverent. After the exhibit, Luna stood in front of a painting draped with a white cloth. It was the only one not yet revealed. A small placard at the base read, "For the ones who never saw the sky." Grace joined her. "Are you ready?" Luna nodded. "You helped me find it." Together, they lifted the cloth. The canvas revealed 5 abstract forms, faceless but distinctly trended in soft hues that bled into one another like watercolor memories. At the center stood a child, reaching toward a burst of warm golden light, as if drawing it down from the heavens. Around her stood 2 adults, one with dark curls, one with pale skin and kind eyes. Behind them, slightly faded, stood 2 shadowed figures, a woman with outstretched arms and a small child with no features, only light. Ethan stepped forward, speechless. "She's here too," Luna whispered. "Who?" Grace asked. "The one I never met," Luna replied. "But I feel her, I think. She was supposed to be my sister." Grace blinked. There were no records of another child, but somehow, deep inside, it made sense. "Maybe she came back in pieces," Luna said. "Little by little, through us." Grace wrapped an arm around her. "Then she's not lost." "No," Luna whispered. "She's home." Later that evening, as the gallery emptied and the lights dimmed to a warm amber hue, Luna sat by the tall arched window with her sketchbook. Outside, the city hummed cars past, street lamps flickered, and life moved on. Ethan stood nearby, watching her. "You've grown into someone I could have never imagined," he said softly. Luna didn't look up. "Is that good?" "It's the best thing that's ever happened to me." She turned toward him, thoughtful. "Do you still think about Mum every day?" "Me too," Luna said. "But lately, I don't feel her as gone. I feel her woven in." "In what way?" Luna pointed to the last page of her sketchbook. It was a drawing of their old living room, the couch, the fireplace, the rug, and there, in the corner, was a small figure kneeling by the window. A woman's silhouette just behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. In the opposite corner stood another figure, a man in a suit, looking lost, but finally turning toward the light. "It's not perfect," Luna murmured, "but it's the truth." Ethan sat beside her. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. She nodded. "There was a time I believed love was something you earned, something conditional. But watching Grace, I realized love is what stays when everything else leaves." Luna smiled. "She stayed," she said. "So did you," he replied. And then, in the quiet that followed, Luna reached for his hand. "Thank you for choosing to see me even when I couldn't see myself." Back at home, the Whitmore house no longer echoed. The rooms were filled with color, conversation, and music. Ethan had converted his office into a second studio, where Grace sometimes painted alongside Luna. And every morning, just as the sun broke over the lake, Luna would sit by the window and begin a new piece, not because she had to, but because now she could. One morning, she stood by the kitchen doorway and called out, "Dad." "Yes, I don't want to be afraid of the dark anymore." Ethan turned. "Why not?" She stepped into the light. "Because now I know. The light always finds its way back." Grace stood behind her, a quiet witness to it all. And in that moment, with coffee brewing and the wind brushing the curtains just so, it was clear they weren't just surviving, they were living. And the first light, it never left. It had simply waited for the right heart to open.